Ben Shapiro tilted his head, a slight smirk playing on his lips before he fired off his line. Did you ever actually study debate, Denzel? Because honestly, you sound more like Instagram Reels than the Oxford Union. A ripple of laughter broke out from the middle rows. The right corner of the stage responded with a long, drawn-out, "Ooh," classic reaction when someone lands a clever, cutting jab. The host worked hard to stay neutral, glancing at Denzel Washington. He didn't frown, he didn't smile. No shift in posture or gesture, just a single, slow blink. Camera 2 instinctively zoomed in for a close-up, but the director quickly switched the feed. Camera 3, almost acting on its own, panned away from the speakers and found focus on the very back row of the auditorium. There, a young black woman, no more than 20, sat bolt upright, hair in a neat high bun, white blouse, hands calmly folded. No smile, no bowing of her head. Her eyes never left Denzel, unblinking, her presence so quiet yet so intense the camera operator didn't dare look away. Ben didn't notice, still smiling, thinking he'd just scored the round. Most of the audience just enjoyed a sharply delivered joke, missing the silent current that now hummed through the room. Only a handful of viewers, those near camera 3, began to turn and whisper, "Who is she? Have you ever been judged because of your voice? Because you didn't sound the way they expected? Because your words weren't dressed in their style?" Where are you watching from right now? If you've ever heard someone say, "What college did you go to?" in that tone, the one that answers itself, leave a comment below so we know you're here. The room, Studio G, 60 seats in a tight crescent, a modest low stage, charcoal carpet, 2 dark leather chairs, a round glass table, soft triangulated lighting. The show's name, Voice of Power. Today's topic, what is intelligence and who gets to define it? Host, Raiden March. Veteran, a man who's interviewed presidents and ex-cons. He wasn't drawn to confrontation, but he knew how to keep tension alive, just enough to keep every eye locked on stage. Ben Shapiro came out first. Navy blue blazer, sharply parted hair, the open face of someone who knows the rules and likes them. His opening was precise, paced, the kind that made younger audience members nod in appreciation. The host introduced him as a national commentator, an author who debates with the brightest and calls out the shallowest. Applause, confident, not overbearing. Then Denzel Washington took the stage. No corporate suit, just a simple black shirt, comfortable shoes, no flash. He didn't need to smile. He didn't look away from anyone either. Raiden welcomed him as actor, director, and the voice for communities whose stories are rarely heard in the room. The applause here was softer, but some clapped long after others stopped. Ben gave Denzel a sidelong glance. Not a challenge, but that appraising look, measuring a man not by his reputation, but by how he takes his seat. Raiden started with the first question. Education. Would you say it's about degrees, about language, or about execution? Ben answered first, measured, structured. To me, education is not about where you're from. It's about being able to stand before anyone and make your case without leaning on emotion. I've worked with people who didn't go to Harvard, but when they spoke, their words had such weight, no one doubted them. The host turned to Denzel. He replied, "I believe education shouldn't be a language barrier. It should be a bridge built on experience," Denzel said, his tone calm but resonant. Raiden nodded, inviting more, but Ben Shapiro cut in, half joking. "You sound like a motivational podcast, Denzel." A few scattered laughs. Some of the older audience members shrugged. A college kid looked down, smiling faintly, not sure if it was funny or true. Raiden pivoted to a stat. According to the latest figures, about 27% of Black Americans hold a bachelor's degree or higher. Yet, their representation as expert guests on academic talk shows remains below 8%. Who do you think decides what counts as true intellect in America? Ben smiled, his words sharpening. "I think the media often confuses emotional storytelling with actual knowledge. We can't let academic spaces get taken over by social media slang, where loudness is mistaken for logic." His tone was pointed, clearly aimed at Denzel, though still wrapped in plausible deniability. Denzel didn't react. He just tilted his head, as if this routine was familiar, waiting to see how far Ben would go. Raiden continued. The energy in the room shifted, not from discomfort, but anticipation, as if something unexpected was about to happen. Ben leaned in. I don't look down on lived experience, but when you represent a whole community and your style feels more like Instagram Live than a classroom, I worry the word intellectual is being redefined into something it isn't. That line wasn't loud, but it fell in the studio like a marble rolling across glass, echoing long after it landed. Raiden looked at Denzel. Denzel didn't flinch. He glanced down at his palms, pressed his lips, then looked up. Not defensive, not aggressive, just the steady gaze of a man who knows what's next. The camera drifted toward the audience. The young black woman in the back row, still poised. She quietly unzipped a canvas pouch in her lap. Nobody noticed. She moved just enough to take out a folded piece of paper, placing it gently on the seat beside her. The note had a diagonal crease, torn from a notebook. She didn't glance at the stage or the camera, just kept her eyes on Denzel. No one in the studio saw, not yet, but camera 3 lingered. Anyone watching the replay would sense something was about to shift. Raiden adjusted his mic, glancing at the studio clock. Talk show danger zone, mine at 6 to 7. If nothing captured their attention, viewers would start scrolling their phones. He turned to Denzel. Mr. Washington, when you say education is a bridge of experience, have you ever been told you were preaching instead of, being academic? Denzel nodded without pause. Plenty of times, usually from people who think knowledge belongs only to them. A few light laughs, less applause, more recognition. Ben sat up a bit straighter, the hint of a grin as if he'd been waiting for this line. Well then, could you tell us, how do you define critical thinking when you're mentoring young people? Raiden shot Ben a look, slightly surprised by how quickly the tone had sharpened. Denzel didn't roll his eyes. He answered evenly, critical thinking is the courage to question even the truths you hold most dear. Several heads nodded in the crowd. Ben turned his palms upward. Not bad. Sounds like something you'd see on a Monday morning Instagram feed. That line fluttered lightly through the air, but it was enough to make a man in the center row shift, tilting his head as if he sensed a turning point. Raiden kept things moving. Mr. Shapiro, you've said before that some activists use education as a banner to hide a lack of real structured thought. Can you elaborate? Ben didn't hesitate. Yes, I never said they're ignorant. I said they're skilled at stirring emotion. But when it comes time to analyze with a logical framework, they always pivot back to personal anecdotes, Ben asserted, voice level, but unmistakably sharp. Denzel simply tilted his head, his face unchanged, just the patient look of a man allowing the other to finish setting their own trap. Ben pressed on, not looking away. For example, can you explain the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning? A soft ooh spread through the audience, not because the question was difficult, but because everyone could sense what it really was. A test, not a conversation. Raiden looked at Denzel. Denzel didn't flinch, didn't deflect, didn't hesitate. Deductive reasoning starts with a general principle and moves toward a specific conclusion. Inductive reasoning gathers many observations to form a general principle. But if you think education ends at knowing the difference between those two, you've never sat in a classroom where a student stays silent because they can't afford the textbook. That line wasn't loud. It came from somewhere deeper, rising quietly but with a force that hit the room's spine. In the back row, the young black woman clenched her hands, not from nerves, but like someone who had just heard her own experience spoken out loud. Ben pressed his lips into a tight, dismissive smile. So, instead of answering directly, you pivoted to a story. Denzel nodded calm. I did, because where I come from, stories are the only things nobody corrects for grammar. A soft laugh escaped from the third row, not loud, but just enough for Ben to realize the energy in the room had begun to shift. Raiden opened a brief segment. In a recent survey, 62% of young people said they feel underestimated when discussing politics, simply because their words aren't standard. And what did they say? I may not say it right, but that doesn't mean I don't have something to say. He turned to Denzel. Have you ever felt that way? Denzel looked right at him. I had a teacher once who made me read every word out loud, When I got it wrong, he didn't correct me. He just asked, "Do you understand what you just said?" If I said yes, he'd reply, "Then you don't need to read it again." The room got quieter. Not the silence of boredom, but the hush when something true is being revealed without needing to be shouted. Ben was no longer looking at Denzel. His eyes moved from Raiden to the camera. He shifted in his chair, like a man realizing, without anyone saying so, that he might be losing ground. In the back row, the young woman leaned forward slightly. The folded paper in her hand was now half open. The audience didn't notice, but the camera did. Ben made one final attempt. "You say you learn from life, but all I see is someone skilled at retelling their pain. That may move people emotionally, but it doesn't help anyone know what's right or wrong." Denzel didn't answer at first. 1, 2, 3 seconds passed. Then he spoke slowly. "You want right and wrong defined by a chart. Where I grew up, right and wrong weren't words on a board. It was about who stayed behind when everyone else left." A row of seats remained still. In the back, the girl folded the paper again, setting it in her lap. Her eyes weren't just watching anymore. They were ready. Raiden sat quietly for a moment and then turned to the main camera. "We'll take a 1-minute break," Raiden announced. The stage lights dimmed. Nobody moved. Nobody smiled. But nobody wondered who was winning. Because by now, this wasn't a debate. It was that moment before someone stands up, and no one in the room is ready for it. A soft silence settled, too long to ignore, not quite long enough to reset. Raiden said nothing. Ben said nothing. In the back row, the young black woman had fully unfolded the note in her hands. Still nobody noticed, but it felt like the room was waiting, even if they didn't know what for. Denzel was the first to break the silence. He didn't rush. He didn't jump in to score a point. He didn't mention Ben at all. He just spoke, and what he said, no one expected. And I used to not understand what I was saying. That lasted through my first 2 years of school. The entire room seemed to exhale as one. I could read, but I didn't comprehend. I could memorize, but I was too afraid to ask again. I nodded because I was scared of being called stupid. He paused, not to collect himself, but to let those words land. I had a teacher, black man, older than my father, who taught a class called Law Explained for People Who Still Don't Believe They Belong in Law School. A few soft laughs, knowing, not amused. He didn't start with chapter 1. He started with a question. Has anyone here ever felt like they weren't allowed to speak up in class? He looked across the audience. No hands were raised. They didn't need to be. Their eyes stayed locked on him. I raised my hand that day. He didn't praise me, didn't cheer, didn't say I was brave. He just asked why. Denzel paused again, letting the audience step back for a second. I said, because I thought smart people didn't need to ask again. A woman in the center row let out a soft breath. Her partner nodded once. He said, the one who doesn't ask is the one who stops learning. Then he looked at me a long time and said, if you passed the test without understanding it, you didn't win. You were just trained to make other people feel less bothered by your ignorance. A subtle ripple moved through the left side of the room. People who'd stayed silent until now started nodding, unconsciously. Denzel looked up. From that day on, I started asking. I asked about things I thought I already knew. I asked how to use certain words. I even asked questions I thought would embarrass me. Raiden clenched his fist, not out of emotion, but from realizing this moment didn't need cameras or lights to matter. Denzel was winning just by daring to say what many had always felt. Even after I graduated, I learned slower. I wrote slower. I spoke less fluently. But I never sat beside someone I didn't understand, and I never made them feel smaller for not knowing. Ben stayed silent. No objection, no retort. He just looked off toward the studio lights, uncertain if what he'd laughed at before was still funny. Denzel finished, his voice steady. I learned from the person who asked me, do you understand? And never asked just to be impressed. I didn't learn to win against anyone in this room. I learned so I wouldn't get lost in a room where no one stops long enough to explain things. Again, Denzel finished, his voice quiet but certain. Camera 2 panned away from the stage, finding the young woman in the back row. She was folding the paper again, not to hide it, but as if preparing to lift it in her hand. No one could have predicted that the moment would come from the audience, not from the host, not from a panelist, not from anyone with a microphone, but from a young woman no one had noticed for over 20 minutes of live broadcast. The student, her bun perfectly tied, her white shirt crisp, her hands never having left the paper in her lap since the show began, stood up. No security guard moved. No warning sound. No announcement. She stepped from her row, walked down the center aisle, and stopped 5 steps from the stage, just at the edge of the light. Raiden March didn't have time to speak. Ben watched in wary curiosity. Denzel met her eyes, holding her gaze. She didn't wait for permission or an invitation to speak. She simply said, "Excuse me, I'm not on the list of speakers, but if it's all right, I'd like to read a letter I once sent to Mr. Washington." The room fell completely silent. Ben leaned back, arms folded. Raiden didn't interrupt. Denzel neither nodded nor looked away. He simply held the young woman's gaze. She unfolded the letter. It was worn, with a slight crease at the corner and purple ink that had begun to fade. The first line had a scratch out, as if she'd written the wrong name at first. She read, not trembling, not too confident, just the way someone reads words they wrote from the heart, almost surprised at their own courage. "Mr. Washington, I wrote this letter at the end of March while working on my scholarship application. I didn't know where to begin. No one in my family had ever written something like this before." Ben sat motionless. The camera cut briefly to his face. The sarcasm that once lingered was gone. The student continued, "I'm the daughter of a single mother. My mom finished the 8th grade. Growing up, I was told not to use words people didn't understand because they'd say I was showing off. But when I saw you speak online, I saw for the first time someone who sounded like my mom, but who was a leader." Denzel closed his eyes for a second, not long, but enough that those near him could see him draw a gentle breath. "I quoted you in my essay. I wrote, 'Education isn't about leaving where you're from. It's about learning how to return without shame.'" A faint sniffle came from the second row. It wasn't clear who. The girl paused, but her voice stayed steady. "You probably don't remember me, but when I got the scholarship, I received a short email. It said, 'I don't need to know your score. I just want you to remember. No one is wrong for asking questions in the language their mother gave them.'" A middle-aged man bowed his head. He'd asked a question during the Q&A, but now he couldn't remember what he'd wanted to say. The student read her final line. "I just wanted to say, if anyone here believes you don't represent true education, they should know you were the first person who made me believe I deserve to learn without lowering my voice or changing the way I speak." A new silence swept the room. But unlike before, when people waited for someone to fill the air, this was the silence of people who knew there was nothing left to say and nothing that needed to be said. Ben didn't bow his head. She didn't respond. Raiden March let go of the table and brought his hands together, not to pray, but with the instinct of someone who had just witnessed something authentic. That moment was never in the script. Denzel kept his eyes on the student. He didn't cry. He didn't stand to embrace her. He simply placed his hand over his chest, right where, by instinct, he keeps the things worth holding without having to carry them. The young woman folded the letter one last time. She didn't say anything else, didn't ask for applause, didn't bow. She quietly walked back to her seat, sat down, and kept her eyes lowered, not out of shame, but because her part was done. But now everyone else in that room watched her, not because she had stood up, but because she'd reminded them of the last time they wrote a letter and weren't sure if it would ever be read. There was no viral hashtag after that talk show, no reaction video arguing over who won or lost, no tweet threads dragging Ben Shapiro's name through trending topics. What spread first, and what everyone remembered, was a 3-minute, 42-second video captured by Camera 3, uncorrected, unscored, showing a student standing at the center of the studio, reading a worn, handwritten letter to the man who once made her believe she was worthy of learning. The clip was uploaded by a small account called Letters We Never Sent. By morning, it had been reshared over 100,000 times, but not with outrage or argument. Just captions like, "I wish I'd written something like that to Mr. Diaz in 8th grade," or, "I was once asked, Do you understand? And it turned out to be the most beautiful question in my life. I cried not because of the letter, but because I once tore up a letter like that, thinking I wasn't good enough to send it. A middle school teacher in Atlanta printed the letter and put a copy on every desk for every student. At the top, she added in her own handwriting, "If you've never written a letter to someone, maybe today is a good day to start." At a community college in Fresno, the dean changed the entire first day curriculum for new students to a single activity. Write to the first person who made you feel like you could learn something. One student wrote, "My grandmother," because every morning she asked, "Did you learn anything today?" Even though she couldn't read. Another said, "A bus driver. He let me sit near the front when I forgot my glasses," without saying a word. No one discussed Denzel Washington's academic credentials anymore. No one asked Ben Shapiro if he had a rebuttal. People stopped taking sides. Because of that letter, the question changed. From who was right to who taught you, without anyone knowing they were teaching. An education podcast in California launched a new series called "My Teacher Didn't Have a Name Tag." Hundreds of listeners sent in stories. An elderly woman shared how a retired soldier taught her to count change. A chef recalled the librarian who first encouraged him to learn French. A woman from Minnesota spoke of her father, who never smiled but always asked, "Did you understand the lesson?" and never once mocked a wrong answer. A public library in Ohio opened a temporary exhibit titled "The Letters We Never Sent." On the walls, people posted notes. To Mrs. Rosen, my kindergarten teacher in 1997, "You didn't scold me when I said the wrong number." I've never forgotten that. To the city bus driver back then, "Thanks for teaching me how to ask prices without fear. I work in sales now." To the vice principal who taught me the difference between "I understand" and "I got the answer right." I'm now teaching that to my child. Denzel Washington didn't appear on any talk shows after that. He didn't give interviews, didn't accept speaking invitations, didn't join any follow-up broadcasts. When a reporter asked his publicist why, they received a single reply: "I don't need to be remembered. I just need someone to remember the first person who made them feel they were worth being taught." Ben Shapiro didn't face outrage. No boycotts, no campaigns. But at later forums where he spoke, audiences no longer asked about degrees or where he studied. They only asked, "Who did you learn from?" And Ben didn't have an immediate answer, because that's not something you find on a resume. A week after the broadcast, a college student posted a photo on Reddit. A classroom whiteboard, bold marker at the top. "No new lesson today. Today we learned to write what we never said." In the corner, taped beside it, was a printout of the student's letter from the show. At the bottom, in a small, handwritten line, "I'm still learning, but I no longer believe I'm lacking." No one knew exactly who the student was. The account that posted the original video didn't use a real name. She didn't respond to any invitations. But one photo surfaced from backstage, grainy, dim. She stood beside Denzel. No hug, no tears. Just Denzel handing her another slip of paper. Only 2 lines written. "This was the question I was once afraid to ask. You just taught me how to ask it in my own voice." There were no more debates after that. Just stories. Stories of people who taught others to write, to speak, to rise. Not through microphones, not on camera, but through a simple question. Do you understand? And that's when people realize Denzel didn't win because he was more educated, not because he argued better, not because he had the sharper point. He won because someone learned from him and never forgot. No one stood to applaud as the program ended. There was no long round of clapping, no colored lights marking the close of a segment, only a room that had quietly experienced something. No one dared to name it right away. Denzel left the stage as the show wrapped. No lingering, no photos, no autographs. He walked down the hallway into the backstage room where a technician handed him something small. A letter folded in thirds inside an unmarked envelope. He didn't have to ask who sent it, didn't need to reread it. It was the letter the student had read aloud in the studio, now returned to him with a new handwritten line at the end. "I'm still learning, but I no longer feel like I'm missing anything." And if anyone asks, "Who did you learn from?" I won't be afraid to answer. Denzel folded it again, said nothing. He placed it in his inside jacket pocket, the one where he keeps things that don't need to be shown, only remembered. A week later, no one talked about the show anymore, no new debates. But people all over began opening old drawers, searching for unsent letters, forgotten class photos, remembering the first question that ever made them want to understand something, not just memorize it. An 8th grade student wrote to her literature teacher, "You never gave high grades, but you always asked, how did that make you feel?" I didn't understand then, but I do now. I know. That was a kind of learning without a lecture. A father told his son how he learned his ABCs in a village school, how his teacher didn't speak English, but always placed a hand gently on a child's shoulder when they mispronounced something, then nodded, never with shame, always with quiet encouragement. No one created a support Denzel group. No one organized a march. No one built an argument to defend him, because no one needed to. He had already been defended by those he'd once given a reason to believe they were worth continuing to learn. Raiden March, the host, said in a private podcast, "I was asked, why didn't you step in when Ben began quizzing Denzel on critical thinking? I answered, because I did that once on another show, and back then I stole someone's chance to prove they didn't need to shout to be heard. This time I stayed quiet, and I learned the right thing." A retired teacher in Florida wrote, "I used to think I taught the wrong way. I didn't use big words, never had PowerPoint. I just asked my students, 'Do you understand?' But when I saw that student read her letter, I realized that might have been the only thing I really taught, and maybe it was enough." One photo spread quietly online at the end, not from the talk show, not a graphic or a slogan, just an old piece of paper, handwritten, folded in thirds, resting beside a stack of worn textbooks in a drawer, taken with a regular phone camera. Caption, "The letter I once thought of tearing up. Now I keep it, not for praise, but to remember someone once believed I was worth teaching." Where are you watching this? In a classroom? On your way home? In a place where you once thought you weren't good enough to understand? If anyone ever asked you, "Do you understand?" and didn't mind pausing to wait for your answer, leave their name or just an initial as a way of saying you haven't forgotten. And if you believe that true education isn't about the length of your reasoning, but about who dares to stop and ask the quietest person if they understand, then subscribe. Because here we keep telling stories where no one wins, except the ones who stay behind to explain what's right, even when no one else is waiting for an answer.